Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and welcome to the 8th video in our series where we are building a small rowing and sailing boat out of skin-on frame construction. Now, if this is your first time with this series, make sure that you go back at least to episode 5, because that's when we reset this project and switched from building a larger rowing and sailing dinghy to this smaller St. Lawrence River skiff. In that episode, I'm going to talk all about what the St. Lawrence River skiff is and why we chose it for this design project. Also, if you want a deeper background on this whole thing, go all the way back and watch the introduction to episode number 1, because there I'm going to tell you all about my own history building larger rowing and sailing boats out of skin-on frame, what went right, what went wrong, and what we're hoping to accomplish in the future. Finally, if this is your first time on the channel, once again, my name's Brian. I've been building skin-on frame boats for over 20 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets for how to build skin-on frame kayaks and canoes. All right, so just starting out with a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this episode. If you remember, at the end of the last episode, we had just finished building the frame and we were getting ready to put on some oil and some varnish, put on the skin and also the 2-part polyurethane that we use. So we're going to talk about that process. I'm going to talk about various modifications that I made, and then I'm going to talk about the 2 on-the-water testing trials that we've done so far, my impressions from both of those, and then finally I'm going to talk about how much this whole thing weighs and whether there's anything that we can do to change that. So, getting into this here, first thing I did at the end of the last episode, immediately took the boat outside and continued with the varnish work. And if you remember from last time, I mentioned that I went a little bit crazy with the varnish on this boat. Generally, I don't like varnish in skin-on frame boats because I feel like it's expensive, time-consuming, and basically unnecessary. But because I already had to varnish certain parts of this boat just to make it compatible with the pedal drive system, I decided to varnish other things. Things got out of control. And what I ended up with is a boat that has varnished gunnels, varnished keel, varnished drive box, and then everything else is oiled. So after an interminable amount of varnishing between the boat and all the various little bits and pieces, I was finally able to get out some oil and apply it to the ribs and the stringers. Like I said before, I would never put varnish on the ribs and the stringers because there's no way that it can penetrate the joints between the two, and then you end up in a situation where you're basically trapping water behind varnish as opposed to sealing water out. So for this particular boat, I ended up using Penafin Marine, which is a honestly fairly toxic product, but it works really well, and I happen to have it here already, which is why I chose it. For the varnish on the gunnels, the drive box, and then all the various other pieces, I used Total Boat Halcyon, which is a water-based polyurethane, which is a little tricky to apply smoothly, but it's really fast and really easy to put on, and it builds really quickly, so it makes that process go a little bit quicker. And then after checking the whole frame to make sure I didn't have any sharp edges or anything like that, brought it back inside and we stretched a skin over it. Now, the fabric that I used for this particular boat is a specific 9-ounce nylon that we purchased from skinboats.com, and we pair that with their proprietary 2-part polyurethane that is also specifically designed for skin boats. And the combination of those 2 materials gives me a covering that is really light, but is incredibly impact resistant and also abrasion resistant, at least for how light it is. And there are many other potential fabric and coating combinations you can use for skin boats, but over the years I've decided to pretty much stick with this system because I think it gives me the best performance and also the easiest and most reliable application. And if you want to learn more about that stuff, I would recommend checking out our Skin on Frame Construction Materials series here on YouTube. We talk a lot more about all the different woods that we use for our skin on frame boats and why we choose them, and also the different fabric and coating options out there. And if you're curious about the durability of that particular product, I would also check out our skin on frame durability video, where I show you physically some of the pretty intense impacts and accidents that we've had with these particular boats and what this coating has been able to withstand. So honestly, the thing that I'm the most excited about with this particular boat is just the color of it. Because up until now, whether I was using our older acid dye coloring system or the newer earth pigment coloring system where the pigment gets mixed directly into the polyurethane, I was always choosing different shades of golden colors just because they look really nice on camera. But after years and years of making golden canoes, I always felt really jealous of the people that I saw on my own student builds blog that were making the darker shades of browns and reds and things like that. And back in the day when we were using the acid dye coloring system, red was just out of the question because red dye always turns orange or pink, and I don't want an orange or pink boat. But since we switched over to the earth pigment coloring system, we've got much more color fast options. Different shades of red are becoming possible, and one of my favorite is this burnt sienna color right here. Now, just a quick side note, this burnt sienna is the burnt sienna that we sell in our store, and it is not the same burnt sienna as the stuff that's sold at skinboats.com. So even if you're getting your coating and your fabric from them, I would recommend ordering the burnt sienna from us, because I haven't had the greatest results with their particular burnt sienna for whatever reason. I don't know why. So anyways, mixed that pigment with the 2-part polyurethane, applied it to this boat. I went with 5 layers on the bottom of this particular boat, and that's what gave me this color right here. And to be perfectly honest, I should have taped off the bottom the next day and put 2 other layers on the bottom to give me maximum durability on the bottom of this boat. But after so many days of varnishing and oiling, I was just quite honestly sick of putting on different coatings. So I decided to just go with 5 layers, which is more than enough, especially considering that I have some other armor on the bottom of this boat, which I'll show you here in a minute. So I think that's a good segue. Why don't we come in closer on the boat here? All right, so starting up here at the bow, this is how that whole arrangement came together after we've got the skin on. You heard me in the last episode talk about how I could make this so much prettier by putting a really nice breast hook in here, shaping it with some brass accents, and then leaving the stem long so it would sweep up a little bit and we'd have this really beautiful shippy looking end. Unfortunately, I tend to subscribe to the utilitarian philosophy of boat building, which means that if it doesn't have a job to do, it doesn't exist on my boat. So I went ahead, cut the stem off right there, stitched the skin around right here, and the combination of the skin and the polyurethane just unifies this end into a solid unit. If there was ever any kind of a structural failure in here, this whole thing wouldn't move a bit. And then back here, I went ahead and drilled for this gigantic 1-inch dowel. Not recommended. If you're going to do this on your own canoe, try to keep this to 3/4 of an inch. And that just makes a perfect handle here, which we've already tested, and it is lovely to carry the boat by this handle. So pretty stoked about how this whole thing came together. Next, coming in really close on this rub rail right here, I did something different on this boat than I've done in the past, and I really like it. Basically, instead of making the rub rail flush with the top of the gunnels here and then running the hot knife down the gunnels to cut the extra skin off, I went ahead and rounded over the edge of the gunnel here with 1/8 of an inch radius, and then I cheated the rub rail down 1/8 of an inch, so this is sitting 1/8 of an inch lower. And then when I went to cut the skin off, I basically just had to take the tip of the hot knife like this at an angle and cut, and this groove guided the hot knife. And you can see we still have some burning from the hot knife in here. There's no way to avoid that, but I feel like this looks a lot better than having that scorching along the top of the gunnels. Also, the other big advantage to doing it this way is when the gunnels start to get beat up over time, all I've got to do now is just sand down the top of the gunnels here, and I can refinish this surface without starting to pull little fuzzy bits of fabric out of this connection right here, or without disturbing the rub rail. So pretty happy with how this turned out. When I get a chance, I will add this to my skin on frame canoe building course so people can take advantage of this. Now, Something I'm not particularly happy with is these mahogany rub rails. I decided to go with this lighter mahogany here for a lot of parts of this boat because I was trying to save a little bit of weight, but there comes a certain point at trying to save weight where you start to lose durability. And I can already tell by some of the things that we've banged into on the water that this particular wood is just a little bit lightweight for this particular task. It sucks because I originally started by making these out of white oak, which would have been awesome for this and pretty much indestructible. But then I got cold feet, I switched over to the mahogany, and now I regret my choices. So in the future, I'm not going to go with anything lighter than cherry for my rub rails, and something really tough like locust or oak would be awesome. Now, along those same lines, I had similar issues with the mahogany that I used for this seat in the bow. Once again, I was just trying to save weight. Also, I wanted to keep everything kind of along the same aesthetic theme. And turns out that this stuff just was not strong enough to support this span. This is a pretty wide span here. This is almost 34 inches. And this is just my standard dimensions for any canoe seat. And when we actually sat in this on the water, it was flexing dangerously. And so I ended up having to take this back out of the canoe, cut the webbing off of the seat, laminate a piece of ash to the underside of it, and then put the whole thing back together. It was kind of a pain, but at least now it's not going to break. Now, as long as we're talking about this bow seat here, a couple more things I want to mention. One of them is that I'm experimenting again with different seat back heights. When I was developing the pedal drive system, after a ton of trial and error, I decided that this was the perfect seat back height. And by perfect, I mean the lowest possible seat back that I felt comfortable using the pedal drive. However, there's an issue when I put this boat on top of my Jeep, because when this is upside down on top of the Jeep, I really like to take advantage of the space right in this area to put a bag of things that goes with the boat. But the problem is, with this height of a seat back, this folds down like this, and it ends up blocking this space, and it makes it kind of tight right here because I've got the pedal drive box in the way. So I decided this time to make a couple of backrests and just spend some time with this slightly shorter one on the water to see if after time, especially because I'm using a PFD at the same time, that this might not be enough, because if it is, I would much rather have it fold down like this, because also if I want to switch on the water to sitting the other way, I can just sit on this a lot more comfortably than sitting on this, which sticks back a little bit further. Now, if I knew I was going to be going out for a day and I wasn't going to be using the pedal drive at all from this particular seat, then I could just go ahead and get rid of this whole apparatus altogether. And something I did to make that easier this time around is I modified this bracket attachment. So basically, if I want to get rid of the backrest, all I've got to do, pull my pins, pull the backrest out of the way. And then before, what I was doing was just using a screw to screw this down into the wood, but it's not really practical to unscrew this, just if you want to go out for the afternoon. So this time what I did was I went ahead and tapped this with a 1024 tap, and then I've got a 1024 bolt right here. And now I can just push this down through the hole really quick and then put this star knob on the bottom right here. And it just makes this whole thing completely removable, but also really easy to put back together. Now, coming back to the stern seat, I also made some modifications to this tiller bar that we use to control the rudder, which we used with the pedal drive system. So, for example, if you were just using this as a rowboat, you wouldn't have any of this stuff right here. But because I'm using this with the pedal drive, which I'll show you here in a second, we need some type of a rudder control. And this is another thing that I worked on for a long time to try to find something that would work well and comfortably. And what I settled on was this particular tiller mechanism, because by sitting in the seat, my hands are already naturally resting right here. And then to control the rudder, I just have to slightly tap with my fingertips one way or the other, and that turns the boat. Now, the issue that I was having with the previous generation of this, and this is a really small change, but it makes a big difference, is that originally I had the rudder line woven through 4 holes here. And the reason that I have it woven through as opposed to just tied off is because if this is set with a friction system, that means if the rudder isn't perfectly aligned, I can actually adjust it on the water, which is a huge advantage. But what ended up happening in real life is that these holes were slightly undersized, and then over time, as the wood swelled and also as this rope started to wear a little bit, basically this rope got stuck and it didn't work the way it was supposed to. So for this round, I made these holes a little bit bigger, and I made 2 more of them. So now I can more easily thread this, unthread this, and the whole adjustment mechanism actually works like it's supposed to. Now, coming back to the rudder itself, this is pretty much exactly what I showed you in the last video. The only difference is that it's got varnish on it. It's just a really simple kick-up rudder. We've got these 2 lines, which go to the tiller bar that I just showed you. And then this is the uphaul line for the rudder blade itself. And the rudder blade is just a flat plate of aluminum down here, which means that it doesn't need a separate downhaul line because it's going to hold itself down in the water. And just like I said in the last video, this is not the most efficient rudder blade, but it is really quick and really easy, and it gives me plenty of steering for what I want to do on the water. So my only big complaint here is that when we took this out for the test paddle, I found that this was sitting a little bit too deep and it was dragging in the water. Honestly, with all the turbulence that comes off of the back of a boat in this area, that really doesn't matter at all. But I am going to have to rebuild this rudder head, bring this up a couple inches, and then just make a slightly longer aluminum rudder blade. Now, before we move on here, I just want to talk a little bit more about this seating arrangement. I really like this rowboat style setup where you've got both people facing each other as opposed to in a canoe where the other person is sitting further forward and facing the opposite direction. I think it's a lot nicer to be able to communicate and hand things back and forth. If you've got the pedal drive, you can share the pedaling duties. And then obviously, if you're going to be using this with oars, the person in the front seat has to be facing backwards. Now, the cool thing about a St. Lawrence River skiff, however, is that you don't absolutely have to use it this way, which is one of the reasons that I made that front seat back so easily removable. So let's say you get into a really narrow channel and you can't use your oars. In that case, you can just switch to canoe paddles and you can paddle this just like a normal canoe. Obviously, because of where this seat position is up here and also the width of the boat, you're not going to get a perfect stroke. It's going to be a little bit wide, but it works just fine. And when we take this thing down to Mexico this winter to do extensive testing, I'm probably not going to bring oars with us. We're just going to bring the pedal drive and the canoe paddle because the oars are kind of bulky and we don't have a lot of room in the Jeep. Now, coming back to the center of the boat, you can see the finished pedal drive adapter box that I put in this particular boat. This is something that I started doing last year with my skin-on frame canoes. The only difference is that this one is installed permanently and those were actually removable, and meaning that you could remove them and then plug the bottom and then return it to a completely stock canoe with the exception of the plug. So this one's going to be in here permanently because I know that I'm going to be using this a lot. And the way this works is we've got this Hobie flipper drive right here. This is the most recent generation of these. The really early generations with the curved fins weren't that efficient and they weren't very enjoyable to use. And they also didn't have kick-up fins, which meant that if you hit something, you could end up damaging the device or damaging your boat. But fortunately, these have a kick-up feature, which makes it just awesome. So if you forget that it's down, or if you crash into something underwater, you're just gonna go right over it and it doesn't damage the device. And then the way this adapts to our particular boats is just slides down in here, like that. And then I usually take this leash and just clip it onto something. That way, if we flip the boat over, I don't lose this expensive pedal drive. And then the adjustability on these things is just fabulous. All you got to do is push this button right here, slide it forward and back to your leg length and release it. And you can put your feet here and pedal. Below, those flippers are flipping back and forth, and that drives the boat forward. And this particular drive is actually a reversible drive, which means that you can pull either one of these levers right here, and that will flip the fins around so you can go backwards or forwards. And then something we just recently started doing, which is great, is I realized that all you have to do is push these pedals like this, and the other person can put their feet on them and they can pedal. So if I've got me sitting right here and I'm getting tired and Liz is sitting in the front and she's fresh, she can just go ahead and put her feet on these pedals and she can work the propulsion while I do the steering right here. So it's a really great mechanism. Unfortunately, it is quite expensive, but if you're someone like me that has physical limitations, this is another way to get back out on the water. Also, if you're into canoe or kayak or any kind of fishing, a pedal drive is just vastly superior than having to drop a paddle or a pair of oars to cast your rod. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about here is the oars, which is how a St. Lawrence River skiff is meant to be propelled and how I think most people would end up using these boats. So similar to an Adirondack guide boat, a St. Lawrence River skiff is usually going to have pinned oars, which means that these oars are held in place, but they can't feather back and forth, which makes them a bit of a liability if you get into heavy wind or rough water because they tend to push back on you and they tend to catch the surface of the water. But if you're just using them in moderate conditions, I actually really like a pinned oar system like this because, especially from a sportsman's perspective, if you need to drop the oar for a second to fight a fish, or maybe you're out hunting, you want to shoot something like a duck or a deer, you can just instantaneously drop the oar into the water. It just trails silently right there, and you don't have to worry about it falling out of the oar locks. So personally, I really like the pinned oars. This particular oar is my own design. This is something that I modeled on Adirondack guide boat oars after I'd used them for a bunch of years. It has a spruce shaft with ash blades laminated onto the sides of it. And the advantage of doing it this way is that it gives you much better material yield of both of these woods, especially this very expensive Sitka spruce in the middle right here. And also you end up with a much tougher blade than if this whole thing was made out of softwood, but also a much lighter oar than if this whole thing was made out of hardwood. And this particular oar, I feel like, gives you all the advantages of an Adirondack guide boat oar, but it is a little bit easier to build. I actually have a whole separate mini course on the website just talking about how to build these oars. I felt like because I've built so many of these things and I've come up with an efficient system, I might as well share that system with people to make oar construction a little bit easier. Actually, there's one more thing I forgot to talk about here, and that is the armor plating that I put on the bottom of this boat. So let's go ahead and turn this thing upside down. And what we're looking at here is 3 high-density polyethylene rub strips with a whole bunch of little holes drilled in them and a whole bunch of little screws fastening them to the bottom of the boat. And we've got one that goes almost the full length of the keel and halfway up the stems. And then we've got 2 on either side that go along the outside of the bottom board. And this is what that looks like in the drive box area. Obviously, this center strip is interrupted by the hole for the pedal drive, but if you didn't have a pedal drive, this would just be continuous. And this method of using 3 strips to protect the bottom of a boat that's built up off of a bottom board is actually something I learned building Adirondack guide boats, which traditionally were built up off of an even wider bottom board and had 3 long pieces of brass. Now, we're not using brass here because it would be way too heavy and way too expensive, but from my own experience of building Adirondack guide boats, I find that this kind of armor protection on the bottom is super useful for dragging the boat over surfaces or logs or the edges of docks. It's just, really functional and really helps to protect the skin in this area. And if I didn't have these 3 strips, I absolutely would have taped off the bottom and put another couple layers of coating just to make sure that I had enough strength for this. So it is kind of a pain to put these on because there is so many holes and so many screws. But at least for this particular boat, I felt like it was worth it. If I was just building a regular rowing St. Lawrence River skiff and I was trying to keep it as light as possible, I might just go with a couple extra layers of coating on the bottom. Now, if you're wondering why I went with HDPE as opposed to any other synthetic material, it's just because VHMW and UHMW expand and contract so much with heat that they both start to loosen up the screws, and also you get a lot of sand and debris underneath them when they're hot and they're bubbling up a little bit. And then Delrin, on the other hand, which doesn't have the expansion and contraction problem, isn't UV resistant enough. And so if this is upside down on top of my Jeep in Mexico for 5 months, I guarantee you that Delrin's going to start to break down and crack. So even though I would much rather that this HDPE be a little harder than it actually is, I feel like it's the best compromise material of all the choices. All right, so that's pretty much everything that we worked on the boat over the last week. As you can see, this is not exactly rocket science. It's just a whole bunch of trial and error. We experiment with things, they either work out or they don't, and then we modify things. And then eventually we turn them into a plan set so you don't have to do all that trial and error yourself. So anyways, moving on to the on-the-water testing. As soon as this thing was ready, we took it down to the river for a few minutes. First thing I did was test the stability. So we got in there, leaned it off to one side. Originally Liz was leaning the opposite direction, which doesn't actually help. But as soon as we both got with the program, we were able to see how much it was pushing back at us. And the stability on this thing is really good, but even more interestingly, it's very different than a canoe. In a canoe, you've got a ton of primary stability where you lean and immediately it's pushing back at you, and then you lean a little further and you end up upside down. Whereas with something with more of a softer bilge and a lot of dead rise that carries its volume up a little bit higher, you don't have that same primary stability, but as soon as you put it over on edge, it starts to harden up. And that, plus just the overall shape of this, is going to make the whole thing a lot more sea-kindly, which means that it's going to be more comfortable in really rough water. It's also going to sail better to the extent that we actually do end up putting a sail on this. Next thing we tested out was the oar position, because even though there are rules of thumb about where you can put the oar pads in relation to the seat, I've never found those to be all that accurate. So what I like to do is bring the oar pads down with some clamps and just experiment with different positions along the gunnel until I find something that fits perfectly to my particular body. So once we got the oar position dialed in, it just took a few minutes and rode it around a little bit. The rowing was really comfortable. The oars weren't exactly the right size because they're a set that I built for a different boat, but they were good enough. And the one thing I really liked about this was the maneuverability of it. And I did depart from the plan set a little bit here. The plans show a 1/2 inch of rocker overall, and I put more like 1.5 inches of rocker in it. And part of that is just personal choice. I prefer a more maneuverable boat. Next thing I took a look at was the freeboard, basically how deep we were sitting in the water. And that is especially important for this particular boat because I have the pedal drive adapter box in it. The boat can only sit so deep in the water before the flood level inside the box gets so high that it basically becomes unsafe. And so functionally what that means is that the pedal drive system is more or less limited to boats that don't sit deeper than 4 inches in the water. So originally for that first test, I didn't actually cut the hole in the bottom of the drive box because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't sitting too deep. So if I needed to just remove the whole drive box basically and return it to a straight up rowing canoe, I wouldn't have to also plug that hole. So looked at the side of the boat to see where the water was, and then I marked that, and then when I got home I stretched some strings across in the drive box location just to see how much freeboard we had for the water level inside the drive box. Originally it looked like it might be a little bit dicey, but then when we actually cut the hole later and took it out in the next test, it turned out it was completely fine. So that was the first test. I would say the only thing that really went wrong on that first test is that we sprung a leak and we started to sink, which is a little bit embarrassing. Being a professional boat builder, we hope that our boats don't leak. But we did bring it home and filled it with water in the driveway, and it was just a little pinhole down one of the stitch lines at the end of the stem, which is easily solved with a little bit of sealant. So next test was a couple days later. We actually cut the hole in the bottom of the drive box and we took it out on the water, this time without the oars and just with the Hobie pedal drive. And I gotta say, I am absolutely in love with the Hobie pedal drive. And part of that is my own personal bias because I have some physical issues with my back and also my arms and elbows and shoulders. And so just being able to be out there, not being in pain and being able to move myself through the water is just a privilege. But also, regardless of whether you have physical issues or not, it is a great way to move a boat. Your legs have so much power and efficiency in them that it just feels like you're just gliding along effortlessly. And just to show you our literal initial reaction to putting this thing on the water with the pedal drive, I'm just gonna go ahead and play a clip right now. Oh, this is lovely.
It's fast.
Yeah, it actually feels like
It feels fast.
it feels faster than the other
Yeah.
canoe.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, super pleasant, really quick and maneuverable, just a really overall smooth feeling on the water. I felt like it felt nicer than a canoe with the same setup. So we just spent about a half hour dinking around in the industrial area, exploring the ships and the pilings. Probably got too close to a big Navy ship that was docked. I'm not sure what the rules are for that, but it was kind of cool. It also had a gigantic anchor chain, really surprisingly big. Then after that, we landed the boat. Unfortunately, it also was leaking again this time because I had missed another pinhole at the opposite end. But once again, that was pretty easy to fill in with some sealant. We also tipped it over on edge just to triple check the height of the water in the drive box to make sure there wasn't going to be any problems. And specifically what I look for there is I want the gunnel to be able to go under the water before water is even near coming over the side of the drive box. And if you're wondering why we can't just increase the sides of the drive box, it's because that starts to potentially interfere with your heel clearance. I mean, for me personally, with a size 9 foot, I could go up to an inch higher and it wouldn't be a problem. But for people with bigger feet, really, they're kind of capped at that height. So that's how I like to kind of plan the boats and design the boats. And it's true that when we load this down with more gear to go camping, it is going to get a little bit lower in the water, in which case I might make some type of a cloth collar to raise that flood level a little bit more just to keep things in the safe zone. So anyways, that was the on the water testing. I feel like things are going pretty good so far. There's a couple more things I've been working on simultaneously over the last week that has to do with the flotation, the sail system, and also a custom transportation cart that I'm making for this boat. But I'm going to wait until the next video when we actually get those things on the water to talk about them. Now, last thing I want to talk about here is how much this whole thing weighs. And I want to start out by saying that there are skin boats much lighter than mine are. You can find skin boats out there that are literally half the weight of this for the same size, but they're not nearly as durable. And for me personally, I look for a durability that is going to be comparable to a modern high-tech composite canoe. So something like a Kevlar carbon canoe. And what I've found over the years is that most boats of the same weight have approximately the same durability. And so this boat right now, with everything that you saw here, including the rudder, the seat backs, the drive box, all of that ends up weighing 70 pounds. And I think if you were to build the same thing out of a carbon Kevlar layup, it would also weigh 70 pounds and they would have equivalent durability. So if I was just making this a pure rowing boat, I think I could get this down to about 60 pounds. But as far as accomplishing everything I wanted to accomplish here with the sailing reinforcements and the pedal drive, to build this again, I could probably take 3 pounds off of it, but not much more than that. Now, as far as how that weight relates to a canoe of similar carrying capacity, nothing is going to be more efficient than a canoe as far as its ability to carry weight for the minimal amount of construction materials. So just for example, if you were to build our 16'4" by 36" wide standard skin-on frame tandem canoe, that would have about the same displacement as this boat here, but it would probably weigh 5 to 10 pounds less, just depending on the wood you use and the different modifications. So if you're looking for a canoe, it makes sense to build a canoe. But if you wanted all the features of something like this, that is designed for rowing and not just retrofitted for rowing, that has that somewhat more seaworthy shape and is possibly also going to sail a little bit better, not to mention looks a little bit prettier, then this is the direction you'd want to go once we actually get these plans out. Now, just to give you a preview of what we're going to be doing next, basically over the next week, I'm going to be working on the carrying cart, the sailing system, and the flotation that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to try to get this out on the water to test all of those things. Also, it may not happen this week, but it's going to happen soon. I am going to load this whole thing up with camping gear to see how it handles an extra 100 pounds. And then we're going to take it out in controlled conditions, but at least a little bit of rough water to see how it handles those conditions with a load in it. So that's where we're heading in the future. Make sure that you stay tuned to the series. As usual, If you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Make sure you click the notification bell so you know when we release a new video. And if you're interested in this skin-on-frame boat or any of our other skin-on-frame boats, make sure you check out our website, capefalconkayaks.com, where we have skin-on-frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on-frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at Cape Falcon Builds, where we post photos and videos of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water. And you can find that same content on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. So that's it for now. Take care. Be safe on the water. I will see you next time.